We've already given a lecture in class for section 6.1, electromagnetic energy. This is an especially long chapter and multiple stages. What we talked about in electromagnetic energy was the light spectrum, especially the spectrum of gases, which are line spectra, and the Bohr model is the section 6.2 will be how the spectrum of hydrogen was predicted successfully by a mathematical model, and which led to the development of quantum theory and the electronic structure of atoms, and how we see that in the periodic table. So we're going to record this for posterity, so let us get going. Okay, the electromagnetic energy, behavior of waves, the wave nature of light. We have two equations involved here. Of course, one gets rearranged, the what's new equation, C over lambda, and the energy of a photon, which is h nu. Distinguish between line and continuous spectra and describe the particle nature of light. What quantum mechanics is about is the wave nature of mass particles. So let us continue. Let's go to the slideshow. The nature of light has been a subject of inquiry. Newton wrote that white light consists of individual colors of the rainbow combined together. Light was composed of streams of extremely tiny particles traveling at high speeds according to Newton's law of motion. I think what impressed Newton was that we could see colors, and so a photon imparted a specific value of energy, and it didn't depend on intensity. So that we would see red, we could see red very brightly, and we could see red very dully. There was something else about light other than simply its intensity, and our eyes were able to detect it. That's why he thought it was a particle. Early 19th century, Thomas Young, light passing through a narrow, closely spaced slits produced interference patterns. Could not be explained in terms of Newtonian particles, but could easily be explained in terms of waves. They don't give a good picture of the slit experiment. But that's what the double slit experiment looked like. There are these two slits. Light passes over both of them, and this is what it looks like on the screen, is that there are interference patterns. Okay. James Clerk Maxwell determined that light was the visible part of a vast spectrum of electromagnetic waves. He was able to show what the speed of radio waves had to be, and it turned out to be exactly the speed of light. Particles and waves are connected on a fundamental level called wave-particle duality. That is, particles of matter and waves of energy, light, are connected, called wave-particle duality. A wave is an oscillation or periodic movement that can transport energy from one point in space to another. Shaking one end of a rope, dropping a pebble into a pond, the expansion of air that accompanies a lightning strike. In each of these cases, kinetic energy is transferred through matter, rope, water, or air, while the matter remains essentially in place. It just vibrates. Waves are not restricted to travel through only matter. Electromagnetic waves consist of an electric field oscillating in step with a magnetic field, both of which are perpendicular to the direction of travel. Electromagnetic waves can travel through a vacuum at a constant speed. That speed is the speed of light. The actual vacuum, the nature of space itself, is the thing upon which electromagnetic waves travel. Initially, it was called the ether, but efforts to measure the properties of this ether as they understood it did not exist, so we just call it the vacuum now. All waves are characterized by the following: a wavelength, the distance between two consecutive peaks or troughs in a wave; the frequency, the number of successive wavelengths that pass a given point in a unit of time; and amplitude, 1/2 the distance between the peaks and the trough, which is from the baseline to the top of the peak is what it is. The unit for frequency, expressed as cycles per second, is the hertz. Common multiples of the hertz are often given, megahertz and gigahertz. The product of a wave's wavelength and its frequency, lambda nu, is the speed of the wave. Thus, for electromagnetic radiation in a vacuum, C equals 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second equals lambda nu. Wavelength and frequency are inversely proportional. As the wavelength increases, the frequency decreases, and vice versa. So here's a wave. This distance is lambda. If you sit here and watch it go by, it has its frequency of nu. The speed at which it's going in this direction is c, and c is lambda times nu. So here they're showing distance traveled in 1 second. This is lambda, this is nu, 3 cycles per second. And they're not giving a value for lambda. One-dimensional amplitude is from this middle point, the 0 point, to the peak height, or the trough depth here. So this is the amplitude. This one has a lower amplitude. One-dimensional sinusoidal waves show the relationship among wavelength, frequency, and speed. The wave with the shortest wavelength has the highest frequency. Amplitude is 1/2 the height of the wave from peak to trough. The electromagnetic spectrum is the range of all types of electromagnetic radiation. Visible light makes up only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. Each of the various colors of the visible light has a specific frequency and wavelength associated with them. So we saw this in class. Gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet, infrared, of course visible light in between them, terahertz, microwave, and radio waves. And we did that example. And we looked at amplitude modulation and frequency modulation as how radio signals are transmitted. Interference patterns arise when light passes through narrow slits closely spaced about a wavelength apart. The dark regions correspond to regions where the peaks for the wave from one slit happen to coincide with the troughs for the waves of the other slit. The bright regions correspond to the regions where the peaks of the two waves or their two troughs happen to coincide. Constructive interference, such interference patterns cannot be explained by particles moving according to the laws of classical mechanics. So I still have that there. And there are many other double slit experiments. This thing with the waves, this is what an interference pattern looks like. So this is what an interference pattern would actually look like. You could represent these as amplitude right there. So how intense that is can be represented with a height here. And so it looks a lot like that. Okay. And so there's an interference pattern for light passing through two closely spaced narrow slits. The spacing of the fringes depends on the wavelength, with the fringes being more closely spaced for shorter wavelength blue light. And they talk about here about standing waves. Standing waves will be important. This is be like a violin string, a guitar string, or you standing here holding one end of the rope with the other end of the rope attached to the doorknob. These are the kind of waves that we imagine occur in an atom. When an atom is at rest, the electrons are forming a standing wave in their orbits. So that's the reason why they're talking about standing waves here. Only those waves having an integer number of half wavelengths between the endpoints can form. A system with fixed endpoints restricts the number and type of possible waveforms. They're leading to why we get line spectra from gas. The spectrum of gases being line spectra. So they're just preparing you for that. All right. Oops. So these are standing waves, harmonic waves, those waves displaying more than 1/2 wavelength, all have one or more parts between the two ends that are not in motion. These special points are called nodes. All right. Two-dimensional standing waves, they want to show you this. You can generate these standing waves on a vibrating plate, and the granules you throw out there will sit on the nodes, and you can have all sorts of vibrational modes here, this being one form and this one having waves that are traveling around the circle, and that give it the spokes of the wagon wheel there. So as I was saying in class, black body radiation is a misnomer because how can you have radiation from something that's black? But this actually comes from people that are firing ceramics in a kiln, that a dark pattern actually comes out brighter. And so in order to get a reproducible example of light coming from a heated object, they want an object that at room temperature is as dark as possible. It's also called cavity radiation. If you have a box with a hole in it, that hole is as dark as you can get because light dies when it goes through there. But when that cavity heats up, that hole will be brighter than something that's not black at room temperature. So it's called black body radiation because if something is as black as it can possibly be, or cavity radiation, if it's as black as it can possibly be at room temperature, it will be as bright as it can be at thousands of degrees. And that can be reproducibly measured. The amount of energy coming from that hole is a reproducible number, whereas if you take different things of different colors, it's not going to be reproducible. that's the reason why they use the word black body. And it's synonymous with incandescence, or light coming from hot things, like hot coals, a hot poker, the filament of an old-fashioned light bulb. Nope, I didn't mean to do that. And the sun follows a curve of black body radiation fairly closely. The deviations are easy to explain in that the surface of the sun certainly is a particular temperature, but we see more than just the surface of the sun. The sun has an atmosphere which is possibly even hotter than the surface because of electromagnetic interactions. And this graininess of it has a lot to do with the line spectra that are being absorbed out of the white light. So you actually can have a absorption spectrum, which is also a line spectrum, which is a continuous spectrum with lines taken out of it. And that's what we see when we look at the sun, if we look at it very carefully. So Max Planck was trying to, he among many others were trying to make a mathematical model of this thermal radiation. And if you try to express it classically based on the way objects in the room function, you cannot model the high energy part of it. The high energy part of it they call the ultraviolet catastrophe. So what Planck had to do is make assumptions that he had no idea where they came from, but under these assumptions, he could make a model that matched black body radiation. Anyway, this is a better view of black body radiation. The peak wavelength moves to lower wavelengths, higher frequencies, as the temperature goes up. So this would be like a cherry red hot poker. This would be a candle flame, and this would be the sunlight. And if you look on your LED bulbs, they are rated in terms of their white light black body temperature equivalent as to what to expect from the color coming from the light. So Max Planck derived a theoretical expression for black body radiation that fit experimental data, but Planck developed his theoretical treatment on the premise that atoms composing the oven vibrated, and the atoms vibrated at increasing frequencies as the temperature increased. But he had to assume that when they released energy according to this formula. The book is making things needlessly complicated by putting this in here. It has to do with the number of photons that are released at any given time, but the fundamental insight is that the energy of a single photon is h nu. H being his Planck's constant, which we call Planck's constant, 6.626 times 10 to the minus 34th joules times seconds. So this quantity, joules times seconds, made no sense physically. And Planck really didn't know what to make of this. I mean, this is as wild as Darwin's Origin of the Species, that humans came from a monkey-like thing. It is a conclusion that he was forced into, even if he didn't like it. So It turns out that this becomes the fundamental of quantum mechanics, and that Einstein revised, came back to Planck's work and showed that energy of a photon is equal to h nu, essentially n equals 1, completely explained the photoelectric effect also. And that was one of his three important papers in the year 1905, including special relativity, the photoelectric effect, and Brownian motion. The next paradox in classical theory to be resolved concerned the photoelectric effect. It had been observed that electrons could be ejected from the surface of a metal. The light had to have a frequency greater than some threshold frequency, but it was completely independent of the intensity of the light. So no matter how strong a red light you shone on the metal, it wouldn't move a single electron. But if the light was above a certain frequency, say it became violet light, then those electrons would be knocked off. Surprisingly, the kinetic energy of the ejected electrons did not depend on the brightness of the light, but instead increased with increasing frequency of the light. And it was Albert Einstein that pointed out that this relationship between the energy of the ejected electron and the frequency of the light was precisely Planck's constant. According to classical wave theory, a wave's energy depends on its intensity, which depends on its amplitude, not its frequency. Classically, a wave's energy depends on its intensity. But in quantum mechanics, a wave's energy depends on its frequency, not its intensity. That is, the energy comes in packets that depend only on frequency, and the intensity has to do with the number of those packets that you're delivering. Albert Einstein was able to resolve this paradox by incorporating Planck's quantization findings into the particle view of light. He won the Nobel Prize for it. Okay, that's right. Actually, they found relativity a little too out there to give the Nobel Prize for. And so they chose between his photoelectric effect paper and his Brownian motion paper, and they chose the photoelectric effect paper. Light striking the metal surface should not be viewed as a wave, but instead as a stream of particles, later called photons. The energy of the photon depends on their frequency. According to Planck's formula, E equals h nu, or you can turn that around, or you can express nu as c over lambda, so E equals h c over lambda. And of course, as we all know, what's nu is c over lambda. Electrons were ejected by photons having sufficient energy, a frequency greater than the threshold. The greater the frequency, the greater the kinetic energy imparted to the escaping electrons by the collisions. Somehow, at a deep fundamental level, still not fully understood, light is both wave-like and particle-like. This is known as wave-particle duality. Photons with low frequencies do not have enough energy to cause electrons to be ejected via the photoelectric effect. For any frequency of light above the threshold frequency, the kinetic energy of the ejected electron will increase linearly with the energy of the incoming photon. So when we see the light from a neon sign, we're observing radiation from excited neon atoms. If this one of the frequencies, one of the wavelengths that comes off of neon is 640 nanometers, what is the energy of the photon being emitted? We can use the form of Planck's equation that includes wavelength and lambda the wavelength lambda and convert the units of nanometers to meters, so the units of lambda and c are the same, and you go through that exercise and you get the energy. It's a very small packet of energy. Scientists in the late 19th century struggled with understanding the light emitted from atoms and molecules. When solids, liquids, or condensed gases are heated sufficiently, they radiate some of the excess energy as light. That's the thermal radiation or blackbody radiation. Photons produced in this manner have a range of energies and are thereby produced in a continuous spectrum in which an unbroken series of wavelengths is present. That's your rainbow. In contrast to continuous spectra, light can also occur as discrete or line spectra, having very narrow line widths interspersed throughout the spectral regions. Okay, we saw examples of line spectra in class. Exciting a gas at low partial pressure using an electrical current or heating it will produce line spectra. And this is what you see in the high intensity discharge bulbs that are used to light streets at night, your street lights. So the bluish ones are mercury vapor lamps. The pinkish ones are high pressure sodium lamps. And sometimes you'll find the ones that are bright yellow, that have only yellow, no other color under them at all. And those are low pressure sodium lamps. Each element displays its own characteristic set of lines. So there's neon. Well, only the orange ones here are neon. Most of these others are fluorescent tubes that have mercury vapor in them, and then they coat the tube with a phosphor in order to display. So this was a bad example of a neon sign because it's not entirely neon. Each emission line consists of a single wavelength of light. This implies that light emitted by a gas consists of a set of discrete energies. The origin of discrete spectra in atoms and molecules was extremely puzzling to scientists. According to classical electromagnetic theory, only continuous spectra should be observed. So that's a continuous spectrum. This is what sodium looks like. They call that the sodium D line right there. This is hydrogen, calcium, mercury. Compare the two types of emission spectra, continuous spectrum of white light and the line spectra from excited sodium, hydrogen, calcium, and mercury atoms. In 1885, Johann Balmer was able to derive an empirical equation for the spectrum of hydrogen atoms. Now, this is an equation that he found worked, but it doesn't give you a model of why it works. And so this it's not a model of why it works. And so it wasn't until Bohr came along that he actually created a model that explains Balmer's mathematics. Rydberg generalized Balmer's work. He developed an empirical formula that predicted all of hydrogen's emission lines. And now we're at the Bohr model, and that we will leave that for another lecture. Thank you very much.